this dichotomy is a philosophy of governance and what seems to be the case right now, and you don't want to jump to too great a conclusions, but what seems to be the case as a result of the 2026 Republican primary is more of a return to traditional governance. As I kind of like to say, let's make state government boring again.
We're back with another episode of Searchlight Report, a podcast from South Dakota Searchlight that brings you up to date on policy and politics in the Mount Rushmore state. I'm your host, Megan O'Brien. It wasn't just the race for the Republican nomination for governor that created a stir during the primary election 2 weeks ago. Voters also ousted 16 incumbents from the legislature, echoing a similar shakeup from 2024. Back then, concerns arose about an Iowa company that was trying to run a carbon capture pipeline through farm and ranch land using the legal power of eminent domain. That's the ability to take private property for public use with compensation to the landowner. Many of the new legislators who won seats in 2024 opposed the project. They ended up passing a law banning eminent domain for carbon pipelines. For insight about the causes of this year's upheaval, I sat down recently with Nathan Sanderson, who spends his winters lobbying lawmakers. He's the executive director of the South Dakota Retailers Association, representing 4,000 businesses across the state. Sanderson formerly served as the director of policy and operations for Governor Dennis Dugard, overseeing 8 state departments. Before that, he worked as the director of policy for the state's Department of Agriculture and taught at the University of Nebraska. So help set the scene for me 2 years ago. 14 legislators who were incumbents lost their seats in that year's primary election. What do you think brought about that change, and how did that shift affect the legislature then?
I think that there were a lot of factors involved with that in 24, but the most overriding factor, I think, was turnout of Republican voters in the primary. You know, if you look back to the primaries in the immediate 2 or 3 years before that, 2022, 2020, 2018, turnout for Republicans was nearly 40%. And in that particular election, I'm working off of memory, I think it was 25% amongst Republicans. It was considerably less. And then what we saw here in 2026 is more of a return to normal. Just a little bit over 40% of Republicans turned out to vote. And so at a high level, I think that was the tail of the tape.
And how did you see that change then with so many incumbents losing their seats? How did that impact the next 2 years of legislative sessions?
Well, over the last number of years, call it the last 6 or so years, the leadership vote, particularly in the House, was quite close, meaning the body was pretty well divided between what you might call traditional Republicans and populist Republicans. In the 24 election cycle, that really kind of switched, where there were a few more populist Republicans than traditional Republicans. And so you saw a turnover in legislative leadership there. And I think at a high level, that's really the most significant impact. I mean, yes, there were individual bills introduced. Yes, there were votes on other bills that were different. But from a management of the legislature perspective, who's in leadership is tremendously important. They're the ones who determine which committees receive which bills. They're the ones who determine which legislators sit on certain committees. They're the ones who determine who chairs certain committees. And so that change in the leadership dynamic was, I think, the overriding impact of the 2024 election.
And so now we've seen another major turnover. There's 16 incumbents who lost their seats in this past week's primary election. What do those losses mean, and what was the difference, or what was kind of similar for those reasons for those losses?
Well, we could talk about this for quite a long time. So I think that the first thing that took place as a result of this election was there's a decided shift back more towards traditional Republicans in the legislature, meaning not all, but a number of the incumbents who lost would associate more with the populist wing of the Republican Party. And so that is going to mean almost certainly a leadership change in both the House and the Senate. And so that will do all of the things that we just talked about, provide new opportunities for committee composition and chair people of committees and that kind of thing. So that's certainly one. When we come back to why did this happen, I think that it really does come down to individual races. And we can throw out a couple of examples there. So let's say go at John Carley's race out in District 29, for example. He had only been in for 2 years. He had moved to South Dakota within the relatively recent past, was one of the kind of COVID relocators to South Dakota, was elected for just 1 2-year term, and then now is out. And he's being replaced by Bill Myros, again, a Republican in that district, who is a longtime resident of Meade County. People call him Dr. Bill. He's a pastor. I mean, he would very clearly align with more of the traditional Republicans, and John Carley would align more with the populist Republicans. That is just a small microcosm of, I think, the change that took place, which was more of a reversion to about the split that you would expect to see in the legislature between those traditional Republicans and then the populist Republicans. Also, one other thing worth noting, I mean, we still have a general election coming up, obviously, but I think even after the general election is over, the overall composition of the legislature between Republicans and Democrats, I don't think is going to be demonstrably different. Currently, we've got 97 Republicans and 8 Democrats. We're going to be somewhere in that kind of ballpark, I think, after the general election. We might have a few more here or there, but if there were more than, say, a dozen Democrats in the legislature, I think that would be kind of a surprise.
Okay. And you mentioned State Senator John Carley's race out in Meade County area. What other kind of legislative races in this primary did you see as kind of those key ones to look at?
Well, we talked about Carley in 29. I guess it would also be worth noting District 29 is kind of a unique example in the history of South Dakota where all 3 of the incumbents in that district lost. And so District 29 is going to have a complete turnover in the senator from John Carley to Bill Myros, and then also in the House. And so Gary Kamak, who had Republican, now going to be joining the House most likely. He was a former Senate Majority Leader, had served in the legislature for quite a long time. And Gary Deering now is going to be newly elected to the legislature. I think my point is in 29, all 3 of those seats turned over. If you look over East River, up in Aberdeen in District 3, it's a similar kind of situation. All 3 of the legislators in District 3, so that would be Carl Perry in the Senate, he lost to Katie Washnach, for example. Katie had run against him 2 years ago when that turnout was so low and lost. Now, this time, it was her second time on the ballot. She had a fair bit more name recognition, and she ended up winning that district by more than 1,000 votes. And so on the eastern side, that District 3 clean sweep is sort of reflective of what happened West River in District 29 with the clean sweep. This is a very unusual circumstance. And historically, incumbents don't lose elections very often. You'll see a couple, maybe a handful in any given election cycle. And so to see 16 incumbents turn over in 2026 is a very unusual situation.
Would you say that it's also unusual to have 2 kind of major shakeups happen within such close years?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, again, as I mentioned, you talked about before, 14 incumbents lost in 24, very unusual at the time. Now to see that pendulum swing back with 16 incumbents lose, I think what this kind of says is we're in a period of volatility politically. I don't think that that's going to come as a surprise to many people. And in South Dakota, of course, that political dichotomy isn't so much Republicans versus Democrats. I mean, yes, certainly that exists, but because the legislature is so heavily skewed toward Republicans and is very clearly a more conservative body than the South Dakota electorate at large. What you've got is you don't even really have two factions, you have three. You have those traditional Republicans, the populist Republicans, and Democrats. That makes the politics a little bit different than a lot of other states in the country.
Right. And so with that split in the Republican Party, what kind of policies do you think maybe contributed to that split that we're seeing now?
Well, I don't know that I necessarily think that it's always individual bills. You know, for example, in 2024, there was a lot of conversation about the carbon sequestration pipeline. And yes, there was some talk about an individual bill, Senate Bill 201, but I don't even know that it was necessarily the bill itself. It was more like a philosophy of, should we as a state have this kind of development, foster it, or should we have a kind of scenario where landowners have the say in what comes on their land or what doesn't? That was sort of the philosophical debate that was out there. Similar in 2026, I think that it's more of a philosophy of governance rather than any specific individual bills. Meaning, over the last couple of years, we saw a lot of social issues come to the fore. We talked about abortion a lot. We talked about in vitro fertilization. We talked about, vaping. We talked about a whole variety of those kinds of things. We also talked about things like public education versus private education and how should we fund those things. We talked a lot about property taxes and whether we should offset property taxes with sales taxes, or should we reduce the sales tax on food, or should we reduce the overall sales tax? Or we had this kind of tax policy schizophrenia over the last number of years. And so, yes, there are certainly specific bills, but I think broader, this dichotomy is a philosophy of governance, and what seems to be the case right now, and you don't want to jump to too great a conclusions, but what seems to be the case as a result of the 2026 Republican primary is more of a return to traditional governance. As I kind of like to say, let's make state government boring again.
And so with these changes, you'd mentioned too that we're anticipating probably some legislative leadership changes as well. Are there any kind of other repercussions that you're expecting to see out of this new kind of turnover?
Well, we're a little bit early, I think, to say, because we've got one key outstanding question that's still lingering, and I'm not even talking about the general election, and that is, of course, who the governor is going to be. When you're looking at policymaking in South Dakota, there are three primary components. You've got the House, you've got the Senate, and you've got the governor, right? Any two of those three can sort of impose their will on the third. Meaning, if the House and the Senate agree to a significant extent, they can pass any legislation they want, even over a gubernatorial veto, if there's 2/3 in both the House and the Senate. Similarly, if the Senate and the governor agree on, say, a specific policy or the budget or that kind of thing, they can very often hold sway over the House, not always. And the same thing if the House and the governor get together, they can often hold sway over the Senate. And so because we don't know yet whether it's going to be Larry Roden or Toby Doden who wins the Republican nomination, and we also don't know what the outcome of the general election is going to be, it's a little bit difficult to look into our crystal ball just yet and say, here are the policies that we're likely to see. The other thing that I think that is really outstanding and maybe undergirding all of this is, what is the nature of the state budget going to be? That's always the top thing that the legislature needs to do. And when we talk about like philosophy of governance, one good example of that is this last year, we had a number, and I'm working off of memory, it's close to 20, maybe 18 legislators between the House and the Senate who voted against the general appropriations bill. They voted against the budget. Well, this is the one constitutionally required thing that we do is we balance the budget, right? And so, yes, they're taking these symbolic votes. I'd have to go back and look, but a good share of the folks that voted against the state budget in this spring lost in the primary election. And I think that is just sort of another example of the return to normal order, I think, that the voters demonstrated in the Republican primary.
We'll be back with more after this short break.
Hi, I'm Seth Tupper, editor at South Dakota Searchlight. If you want to know more about what questions will be on the ballot or keep up with the candidates for state and federal elections, we've got the coverage you'll need this election season. Our reach goes from East River to West River with journalists in Sioux Falls, Pierre, and Rapid City. You can check out our election coverage on our website, southdakotasearchlight.com, and subscribe to our free newsletter at southdakotasearchlight.com/subscribe.
Right. I want to go back to the primary for governor. How did you see that race impacting these legislative races?
Well, it was certainly clear that Dusty Johnson and his group had played an active role in recruiting and supporting some of the candidates for the legislature. There were other groups that had nothing to do with the Johnson campaign who were also interested in sort of restoring more traditional Republicans to the legislature. I think that those efforts were very concerted, they were deliberate, they were well-funded, and I think the results kind of speak to the fact that they were successful in those endeavors. Outside of that, it also seems clear that there's a little bit of a disconnect between the legislative outcome and the gubernatorial primary outcome, meaning most of the folks who won in the legislature probably aren't going to be aligned with, say, a Toby Doden agenda. And I think that it would be very clear that should Toby Doden eventually become governor, he would be facing a legislature that was not particularly aligned with the rhetoric that he's used to this point in the campaign. So that could be an interesting outcome. I also think, though, that apparent dichotomy is simply a product of the way that the Republican primary elections for governor work, meaning you had a four-way race, and it was generally pretty split. I mean, when the lowest vote getter gets 21% and the highest vote getter gets 31%, that's pretty well, the votes are pretty well spread across the board. And so it will be interesting to see what happens in the primary where Toby Doden didn't receive more than 50% of the Republican vote in any county. So meaning the three sort of more, the ones with government experience versus the one guy who had no government experience. Between those three, Larry Roden, Dusty Johnson, and John Hanson, they got 69% of the vote, and he got 31%. And so with Toby not winning more than 50% in any one county, I don't know that you could necessarily say, oh yeah, there's this huge disconnect between the gubernatorial vote and the legislative vote. I think what will be interesting is the outcome of the runoff, of course, between Larry Roden and Toby Doden.
Absolutely. And you mentioned too, if Toby Doden were to take the primary, win in the general, he would be coming into a sort of hostile legislative environment as well.
Well, I think a lot of the legislators who were elected in this Republican primary have experience or who would, as I mentioned, align themselves with the traditional Republicans. And so to use just one example, Toby Doden has said a number of times that he's going to eliminate property taxes. Well, property taxes in South Dakota raise about $2 billion, and all of those dollars go to support local units of government. Your local school district, your county, your municipality, your ambulance district, and your fire district, and your water district, and all those kinds of things. That money does not come to Pierre. Well, so you can't just wipe away $2 billion and not fund the roads in your counties or, the sewers in your cities or whatever. You have to fund some of these things. And so I think that the legislature, the composition of it when they convene in January 27, they largely recognize these realities. And those realities, are a little bit at odds to the rhetoric that we've heard from Toby Doden.
Okay, and so property tax, obviously, one of the bigger conversations of the legislative session. So was data center legislation. What kind of big topics do you see maybe carrying over into this next year here?
Well, I think that the property tax conversation is largely done. I mean, there's always something to do on property taxes, but we had 3 legislative summer studies on this topic over the last 5 years, and so I think people have largely said it's now time to take these changes that have been made and let's see how they will work themselves out. I mean, one of the things that never got spoken about during the primary for governor was that none of these changes are going to actually go into effect practically until 2028 because we're not changing the sales tax until next June. We're not going to see the dollars that would offset the property taxes for 27 for a while. So you've got to wait basically a year and a half from now. And so I think that there's going to be an appetite to just kind of let some of those things sit. We are going to have to see what the budget looks like. And so how are we going to fund our schools, I think is going to be a big topic of conversation. We're going to have to see just generally what the budget looks like. I mean, the economy right now is a little bit, it's sort of consistent, steady maybe even, but a little soft, meaning we've got the controversy in Iran and the war that's going on there, which has increased fertilizer prices. We've got this screwworm situation that's impacting cattle. And so is that going to drive cattle prices up? Who knows? The price of corn and soybeans isn't particularly good. And so the ag economy is going to be a little bit disjointed. And as we know from our retail businesses across South Dakota, when ag does well, our economy does well and our retail businesses do well. And so that I think is going to be a really big topic of things. I'm hopeful that we will see less on the social issue front when we come in January. Just on a personal level, I think that that's a little bit outside of what the scope of government should be. And I think historically, South Dakota has taken a little bit of a hands-off approach towards social issues and sort of acknowledge that we're a free state and, let people sort of behave in a free fashion. But we'll have to see what comes in January on that front.
Okay, and then also looking at some of the losses and also some of the members not running, the Freedom Caucus looks like it'll only have one person left to be representing them, Representative Phil Jensen out of Rapid City. He's a Republican returning from that public list of members. Can you explain what the Freedom Caucus is for people who don't know and how the departure of so many of its members will affect the legislature?
Well, that's an outstanding question because what the Freedom Caucus is in South Dakota is a little bit of an unknown. It's a relatively small group of folks. I think that there were 9 publicly identified members prior to this primary, and as you noted, I think there's just one left. To the extent that it continues to exist, I think that there were a few new legislators who could be aligned with that faction. Honestly, in the legislature, that group of folks has not played a significant role in policymaking. It's been 9 out of the entire legislature. That's not even 10%. They have, yes, met sort of separately. By definition, they've caucused, a little bit different, but they've also caucused with the Republicans as well in both the House and the Senate. And so I think what it has been mostly a mouthpiece to sort of project a particular view that those relatively small group of people has.
Okay. And how do you think campaign financing played a role in this year's legislative race? I know that the South Dakota Retailers Association has their own political action committee. What issues did you guys focus on, and how do you think financing played a role?
Well, so for better or for worse, political action committees are the way that you support candidates in the state. So we've got about 4,000 members around the state. The Retailers Association puts dollars into a political action committee so that we can then support legislative candidates who reflect our values. What are our values? We want low taxes, reasonable regulations in South Dakota to be a great place to do business. We want reasonable, thoughtful, common sense legislators who are statesmen, who put the good of the state above their own personal ideology. In a high level, those are the kinds of candidates that we support. And definitely in this primary, there were a number of political action committees, largely funded from South Dakotans, by the way, or by groups like ours who represent South Dakota, whether it's businesses or bankers or whether it's school teachers or whomever. A lot of these are South Dakota based efforts. But there's no question that more of the traditional Republicans in the primary received the support from political action committees like ours than did the populist Republicans.
I think that's all the questions that I have for you. Do you have anything that you want to mention that I didn't bring up at all?
Well, I think that because South Dakota's legislature turns over every 2 years, we have elections, even our senators only serve 2 years, right? And so you see a lot of turnover in the legislature just naturally. Somewhere between about 30 to 40% of the body turns over in every single election. So if you've got 105 legislators, you're looking at 35 people or something like that on average that would be new in any given election cycle. And I think that in this particular election cycle, of course, depending on who the governor is, you're going to see a return to the more bland, the more mundane. I'm optimistic that we're going to not see state government have these, big headlines and things. It's going to do what it's designed to do, which is provide the citizens of the state the things that they need. They need roads, they need services, they need the ability to go hunting and fishing and, those kinds of things, and to stay out of their business otherwise. And I think that largely this legislature is going to reflect that traditional philosophy.
Though the legislative primaries have already been decided, the race for the Republican nomination for governor continues, and advance voting has already begun for the runoff election. Voter registration is open through July 13th. The special election is July 28th. To learn more about the candidates in the race, check out our past episodes with Governor Larry Roden and businessman Toby Doden, and our episodes explaining about the race with columnist Kevin Worcester and political blogger Pat Powers. That's all we have for this episode of Searchlight Report. Audio for this episode of the podcast came from recordings by South Dakota Searchlight. The podcast is based on reporting by South Dakota Searchlight's staff, editor Seth Tupper, senior reporter John Holt, and reporters Joshua Heyer, Mackenzie Huber, and me. I write the scripts and produce the audio with editing by Seth Tupper. South Dakota Searchlight is part of States Newsroom, the nation's largest nonprofit news organization. Until next time, I'm South Dakota Searchlight's Megan O'Brien with the Searchlight Report.